Hello everyone, bonjour tout le monde. We are here today on the unceded territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. It is important to not just recognize the land, but the ongoing genocide that is happening on this land as well. I will also like to acknowledge the situation and war that is going on in Ukraine and continue our request that all possible diplomatic and sanction pressure be placed, as well as much as possible all non-military aid. Before I start, I do have to say, when we come here to talk about party drama, the room is full. When we come here to talk about the climate crisis, there's not so many people here. And so it begins. We're here today to talk about the most recent IPCC report that was released yesterday and the continued state of emergency that the world is in with the climate crisis. Et chaque fois on voit un rapport du GIEC, de l'ONU, je me souviens de mon expérience, la coulée de boue qui a tué ma mère et a détruit ma maison. Je pense des urgences climatiques qui déroulent à travers notre pays et le monde entier. Tout le monde qui perd comme moi et les situations encore pires. La souffrance est immédiate, mais encore nous pouvons l'arrêter. Chaque jour est une opportunité de sauver des vies. This report highlighted a number of things. Big among them was adaptation. And adaptation can take many different looks, ways, other things. But in particular, I would like to highlight a few important things that we need to do as soon as possible. These include dealing and handling and protecting biodiversity, protecting ecosystems, restoring ecosystems, and strengthening our social safety net. The important thing I think here to talk about is the fact that this crisis is ongoing. So every time we see a report, it's all the alarm bells ringing. And yet the response seems slow because we don't think we can act. But instead, action is immediately possible on the ground and at every level in a way that every moment is actually going to save lives and guard us against further suffering. The preparations that are necessary are varied. I speak, of course, of my personal experience, and this means every community across our country needs to prepare for the incoming disasters, extreme weather, and the worsening of it, as every year is going to be notably more difficult than the previous one. And so this means supporting our municipalities to be able to get ready. But in adaptation, it sometimes sounds off that we talk about ecosystem preparation and restoration. But really, this is how we mitigate climate change. It is both how we bring down and store our carbon, but it is also how we prepare those ecosystems for the incoming changes. And again, we have solutions that are easily accomplishable, and yet they are not happening, or not nearly fast enough. The other thing I think about when it comes to preparation is the fact that this crisis is already upon us across the world, and especially across the global south. Here, in a place of much prosperity, we need to protect ourselves as well, but we need to be ready for what's coming from the rest of the planet. This is urgent, and also we need to be ready for the climate refugees that will be coming our way. And as we look at our immigration and refugee policy, both for things that are happening more recently, a family freezing to death at the border, and the many people who are fleeing hardship and persecution, even just south of the border. We need to get rid of the Safe Third Country Agreement, and this, I promise you, is climate policy. The other big thing that comes to mind that was also included in the report is a discussion about the impacts on mental health. This, I also come back to my own experience. The grief, the trauma, my experience of anxiety and PTSD that I carry with me because of environmental disaster. I am just one person with a lot of privileges, and still this happened to me. So what awaits us all? I watched my community also go through this. And so it has many pieces, whether actually going through disasters, watching these things happen to other people, facing our own mortality and loss, to facing our beloved species, ecosystems. This is all grief. This is all anxiety. So we cannot go through all of this together without a plan to support everyone and their mental health. Anxiety, I think, can be tempered a little by action. But grief, in grief, we need each other. So what can we do? Je regarde au budget, j'espère ce mois ou le prochain mois, mais vraiment, chaque politique, de n'importe quel sujet, est une opportunité pour agir contre la crise climatique. Nous avons apporté aujourd'hui une liste d'actions. This includes, and of course are not limited to, and I promise again, I start to sound like a broken record. Every time we ask for the same things and we don't think they're so hard, but here we are. Address transition for fossil fuel workers. End of all producer subsidies for fossil fuels immediately, rejecting any fossil fuel expansion, operations and infrastructure, and of course, an immediate cancellation of the TMX pipeline project. Rebuilding a network of affordable and accessible ground transportation between communities across Canada. Providing predictable, ongoing funding for a renovation wave of deep retrofits to all buildings in Canada, with priority given to low-income and marginalized communities. Investments in zero-carbon aviation, supporting solar roofs and other renewables in residences and across institutional buildings. Encouraging renewable energy installation and in distributed systems across the country. Engaging Indigenous communities in renewable energy and pumped storage. Increasing carbon sequestration through soils and prairie long grass management, and building a national electricity corridor for 100% renewable power. And these are the asks, of course, of government. But I want to end on something else, because so long we do not see the action we need to see. And yet I come here with all of this, not feeling despair, but feeling hope. Because at every time we are told again, we still have a window. It's closing, but we can actually stop the ongoing suffering, reduce the amount of loss that is going to happen because of the climate crisis. And I want to say to everyone that the power rests in our hands, because the answer here goes beyond governmental requests, which are necessary, but to us, in community, because we are the ones that can provide, by working with each other on the ground, food security, water security, focusing on each other's health, well-being, caring for one another, making sure that our neighbors are housed, and housed in a way that will protect them from the worst effects that are coming our way. Our future is yet undetermined, and we look ahead unsure. So I welcome you all to think about the positive ways we want to be with each other in the future, to determine our shared vision, and reconnect with our shared humanity. Climate justice, because it has to be climate justice. Because as this hits the marginalized first and more severely, is truly in our hands. It is ours, as is our future, because we are the many and we carry the power. Thank you. Merci. I will now pass over to Mike Morrice. If I can, you know what, I give up.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kuttner, and thank you all for being with us this morning, both those of you that are online and those of you joining us in person. These are important moments. Whether it's a code red for humanity or an atlas of human suffering and a damning indictment of failed climate leadership. I want to pause to appreciate the efforts of climate scientists around the world who've come together to help us understand the moment in time we are living in. For myself, I can share, it was back in 2018 when the IPCC released the 1.5 degree report that actually was part of what led me to decide to run, recognizing the existential threat we find ourselves in. And really, what's the point of anything if we don't have a safe climate future for our kids, our nieces, our nephews, and our grandkids? And so I appreciate the work that you are all doing to ensure we center climate science in the midst of this conversation. And as you heard from Dr. Kuttner already, what a unique moment we are living in, where this window is rapidly closing. And so in saying so, I want to pause by citing directly from the most recent report, specifically, the cumulative scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and planetary health. Any further delay in concerted anticipatory global action on adaptation and mitigation will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. In brackets, very high confidence. If that's not clear enough for us to take action, I'm not sure what else is. What we might share with future generations when they look back on this time and observe whether we chose to listen to scientists and Indigenous leaders and young people who are calling out to say, enough is enough. And so you heard already from Dr. Kuttner some of the specific calls to action for this moment in time we are living in. I'd like to close by sharing some more of those. Very specifically, this federal government has the opportunity to reject Baie du Nord by March 6th. If they choose not to do so, this is the equivalent of 100 coal-fired power plants over the course of 1 year, the possibility of a further 1 billion barrels. It would be the first of its kind that is deep offshore drilling off the coast of Newfoundland and Labrador. Secondly, we've got to stop the subsidies to fossil fuels. By whatever name they're called, whether you want to call it an emissions reduction fund, or you want to call it a tax credit for carbon capture and storage and $50 billion more, that's $50 billion that could be going to a just transition for workers today. And we've got to be honest about the need to step away from the Trans Mountain Pipeline. It was ecologically the wrong choice years ago. It's very clearly financially just as poor of a choice today. That, even most recently, $8.9 billion over budgets, a challenge when we start having more difficult to keep track of the billions of dollars of a poor investment that this now is. Each of those dollars, again, which could be going towards what we could start investing in. And yes, it begins with a just transition for workers. It's also investing, as you heard, in ground transportation, investing in via rail, investing in high-speed rail, in providing that ongoing funding we need so that Canadians across the country can be investing in retrofits of homes, of small businesses across the country, and of course, building an electricity grid that moves towards 100% renewables. These are the choices that we can be making today if we choose to listen to the science that has been clear and is only clearer every day. Thank you. And I will pass it to our parliamentary leader of the Green Party of Canada.
Thank you, Amita. Thank you, Mike. I'm going to be brief. I've been working on the climate crisis issue before it was a crisis. I've been working on the issue of climate change before the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was formed, because I was working in the federal government as an environmental advisor in the mid-'80s. So I learned my climate science from Environment Canada scientists in 1986 and 87, and we hosted the world's first large international scientific conference in June of '88. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was one of the things that came out of that. So I want to speak to what this body is, because we go by it fast. Le GIEC, ce n'est pas un groupe militant écolo. Le GIEC, ce n'est pas un ONG. Le GIEC, c'est un groupe énorme établi par leur gouvernement. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is not an environmental group. It is not a group of extremists. It's government scientists appointed by governments, independent academics, and constitutes the largest peer review system ever created. By its very nature, it underestimates the threat and consistently overestimates how much time we have. Quand le GIEC a dit chaque fois que la situation est urgente et la prochaine fois plus urgente, et le gouvernement laissait tranquille, nous avons le temps parce que c'est reste de devenir neutre carbone par 2050. Net zero by 2050 is a lie. The IPCC has never said we're safe if we get to net zero by 2050. The IPCC has only said 1.5 degrees Celsius global average temperature increase is the best we can hang on to now, and it's not safe. We're at 1.1 degrees Celsius now, global average temperature increase. And I can tell you as a British Columbian, we were not safe this year. My stepdaughter, my husband's youngest daughter, nearly died in the heat dome, and she's young. We lost nearly 600 people in 4 days in British Columbia. Lit and burnt to the ground before you could get the fire truck out of the fire station. And then we had the floods. It's not safe now, and we're at 1.1 degrees Celsius. To hold on to 1.5 degrees Celsius, the IPCC has been clear, and again, they are not radical. They, by their very nature of taking years, this is the 6th assessment report. They come out every 7 years. They review the science over the last 7 years. They don't review what came out 2 weeks ago. By its very nature, the IPCC underestimates the risk and overestimates how much time we have, and they are saying we're out of time. This means immediate action to get off fossil fuels altogether. Set a date and work towards it. Tell the workers and make sure they're taken care of. Work in solidarity with marginalized people. This report speaks to how climate crisis affects people and communities and ecosystems. The need for adaptation is immediate and should have been delivered yesterday. We are running out of time in real time. This is not a bunch of political promises that would be nice to keep if only we could. This is a matter of life and death. And just as much as the people in Ukraine are fighting for their survival, and God bless them, and please, God, let them survive, and let the world come together to support the people of Ukraine, it means a lot to me when the head of the Ukrainian delegation at the IPCC, Svetlana Krakowska, says the root causes of the war in Ukraine and the climate crisis are the same. Dependence on fossil fuels, addiction to fossil fuels. And as Dr. Krakowska said, we will not surrender Ukraine. And she also expressed the hope that the world would not stop in the goal of a climate resilient future. That means this report is part of the sense of urgency and part of the sense of solidarity that says we don't give up on democracy, we need it, and we don't give up on protecting our children's future, because right now we are deeding to our children. When Mike says future generations will look back, oh, really? Will there be future generations? Will they have the capacity to look back if human civilization collapses? And I'm not speaking in hyperbole. I'm speaking on the science. We have to change, and we have to change yesterday. Merci.
Pour finir, j'ai quelques commentaires aussi. And one is to talk, something I rarely actually do, was to bring out the nerdy side of the physicist, to say, let's talk about the 1.5 degree target. Because everybody says, if you do all these things, we'll hit 1.5. Well, I'm sorry to say, but that's not how the world works. 1.5 is already a probabilistic average, meaning the targets that we're heading for, the changes that we're asking for to attempt to hit 1.5 is the top of a bell curve, which means even if we do everything we need to do to head for that goal, you still have a chance, a good chance, of ending up at 4 degrees and complete destruction of this planet. So I would like to echo the calls that this is somehow, saying we have more time than we do. Because it is. Because there is a miscommunication, I believe, fundamentally about what 1.5 degrees actually is. The other thing I would like to say is that we talk about governmental responsibility and we talk about the things that we can do to be preparing on the ground as communities. But I want to issue a warning and something worrying that I see, which is in the aftermath of the floods, the idea that it is going to be up to personal responsibility, purchasing insurance, for instance, to prepare for the climate crisis. And we cannot stand by and watch the responsibility of suffering through this and responding to this be put on the individual and on capitalism. We need the government to be ready to support everyone and the collective to support everyone in the response and the ability to recreate and develop and construct our lives after disaster. Thank you.
We'll now start the question period. On va maintenant débuter la période de questions. One question, one follow-up. We'll start in the room.
Hi, everyone. David Thurton from CBC News. Why does your plans or your proposals to speed up adaptation sound more like mitigation, canceling fossil fuel subsidies, canceling the TMX? I'd like to hear about what you're specifically proposing for people who live in flood zones, for people who would have to, are going to see increasingly, hotter and hotter summers. What are you proposing, specifically for adaptation? I realize a lot of mitigation, a lot of adaptation is mitigation, but specifically, what are you proposing?
Yeah, so I'm going to go over all of it a little bit. And so I think that mitigation, adaptation, there's kind of all sorts of levels of preparedness. And adaptation is both making the world different, so not dependent on fossil fuels and stuff like that, because that is permanently necessary for the future for hundreds of years and hopefully beyond. So that I do count as a process of adaptation. And mitigation, adaptation, you're right, are not interchangeable. Mitigation, though, can also be on-the-ground mitigation of something like sea level rise, which is also adaptation to prepare the community for not having to deal with things like that. So there are a lot of different possible adaptation strategies, and I think that the ones that I mentioned were broader. So ecosystem restoration, carbon sequestration in soils. Carbon sequestration in soils is kind of a twofer in the sense that you are actually protecting and preparing the ecosystem for what's coming, and you are actually also mitigating, hopefully, the increase in carbon. On the ground adaptation is going to require whole-scale community development, basically. And this is where I really mean it when I say that every policy needs to be climate policy, because a lot of the adaptation goes straight into everything else. When we're looking at our housing policy, we can't just be putting up buildings the way we used to. We can't even be saying as we update buildings, they're going to be updated the way we used to. That's where that comes in. When we're talking about retrofits, we're not just talking about retrofits to save energy. We're talking about retrofits to protect people against heat domes, to make sure that our streets aren't flooding, and things like that. And I would go so far as to say the other strategies are multifaceted as well, in the sense that you need to be preparing communities for the breakdown of supply chains. So it is an adaptation strategy to have an urban farming plan, and also to have urban water storage outside the city as well. All of these things are adaptation strategies. Very much it will be also community by community. So I would highly recommend that the government invest in supporting communities individually to come up with their own plans, because it will look different. Adaptation is going to look very different depending on the type of disasters you're expecting. So you can prepare people, you can prepare our health systems, and then you can also say, okay, what are the extreme weather events that any given region is going to experience? And then let's put in a plan for that. Sea level rise, make your choice about which way you're going to go about that one. Are you raising yourself up, or are you letting the water in? And same for heat, for fire, for all of these things. It gets down to that level because it'll look different in every place. And we have the models to show us what we're expecting. And again, in terms of every policy is climate policy, I mean it. This is like, we're going to comb through everything that comes up and say, okay, so how are we planning for changes for farming? How are we planning for everything? And so it's hard to say what are the exact policies because it's shifting the lens of all policy and your entire budget planning to be making sure that you're taking into account what's needed to prepare.
Just going to follow up on it's a similar subject, but it's slightly different. We seem to be going from crisis to crisis, emergency to emergency. What impact do you think that's having on governments, because it's not just the federal government, and communities addressing, what you say is the real emergency, or what could be the greater emergency, climate change?
Mm-hmm. All of these crises have the same root. They are all coming from the way that we have structured our current society. So in a way, what we need is transformation. And we're almost a moment too late. So that is the true call, is to say, let's confront the systems upon which our country and our government are actually placed and structured. In that when we are dedicated to extraction and consumption, then we can't get out of any of these crises. So let's list them. We have the climate crisis, we have a health crisis, we have an inequality crisis, et cetera, violence escalating across the globe and at home. These are all because people are frustrated. It is all because people don't have access to the lives they want to be able to live. When we decide what we do, we no longer have the choice to find meaning, to feel like we can act in the face of any crisis. And so, yes, it is upon the government in kind of layers and layers of chaos in every direction. But if we transform instead, we say we change now, we put well-being first, we care for each other, we throw out the interest of putting profit before people and planet. And that transformation, the way we would live with each other, the way we would govern with each other. This may sound a little far off, but I actually think it's what we need. And it's the only thing, because otherwise it's crisis after crisis and picking which one's more important. But if we solve them all at the same time, it'll work.
We'll now go over to Zoom for a question. Palak, when you're ready.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thanks for taking our questions again. You referenced the importance of on the development of the national adaptation strategy. I believe it's due sometime this fall. Given that you noted the crisis, I think you said, is already among us, and that blueprint itself is designed to get more jurisdictions on board. Can you speak about what your specific hope is within that strategy, especially to curb climate-related disasters? I do know your personal experience on the matter, but I'm thinking of situations like BC last fall.
Yeah.
I'm just curious what that tangibly means, either financially on the government's books or what kind of programs we need to see.
Yes. So a couple different things on that. Their national adaptation strategy, working with everybody, it really is to make sure that plans are localized. And when you're looking at different strategies, it is making sure that we have the shared expertise at that level. Because I think that there's two things. There, as you said, there's the financial support that is going to be completely necessary, but there's also the organizational support and expertise support. Because I think a lot of localities, a lot of municipalities, a lot of regions will not automatically have access to the expertise, the climate science, and the kind of experts in terms of mitigation and development. And so if we're looking at a national strategy, the benefit of it is being able to put resources where they most need to be. And then as development of plans shows up in different places, you can network that so that the best help is provided to each place and the expertise is shared. And again, if I was looking, I know more too about BC at home and flood preparation and stuff like that. But I know that it does differ in different regions. And also, it does come down to much more fine-grained construction. It matters how your sewers are set up, how your roads are constructed and paved as to what structures and plans you will actually need. So that's what I mean by, I think, is the structure together, the sharing of expertise, the networking of plans so that people get the support and the help and the plan done as soon as possible and in a way that is actually very much tailored to what they need. And that's a combination of federal level resources, both money and otherwise, and then working with localities for what they know best for themselves. If anything to add?
Follow-up?
Thanks. Thanks. My follow-up is a bit of on a different note, and I don't know whether Dr. Kuttner wants to answer this or Ms. May. It was referenced a couple of times, the nixing of fossil fuel subsidies and funneling that cash elsewhere to guide the transition. Recently at, I believe it was the Natural Resources Committee, we had one of the advisors on the federal Net Zero Advisory Board come forward and say that any tools to remove emissions should be used toward the tail end of the path to 2050. We know that Mr. Freeland is considering the CCUS tax credit. Can you speak about your desire to see or end those plans and how programs or pitches like these tie into the overall path toward net zero?
I will let our parliamentary leader answer this mostly, but I do want to say a couple things, and that's net zero by 2050 is a dangerous idea because we really need action as soon as possible. So putting any of these things at the tail end is extremely risky. And yeah, I will let you go over details.
Thank you for the question. It is the case that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has put forward the idea of net zero by 2050 and finding magical sucking machines to get carbon out of the atmosphere. Carbon capture and storage, it used to be called. Now it's carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And the difference is that it's another way of extracting fossil fuels while pretending you're fighting for climate change. Because the utilization is that as you inject carbon dioxide down underground in the hope that that becomes a good way to address the climate crisis, what you're actually doing is also basically loosening up the little bit you couldn't get before to get more oil out of the ground. So carbon capture, utilization, and storage is yet another subsidy to fossil fuels. The government has pledged to end subsidies to fossil fuels. Canada pledged that under Stephen Harper in 2009. And we cut some and find innovative ways to create others. As Mike Morrice suggested in his presentation, things like the Emissions Reduction Fund for onshore emission reductions, which the Commissioner for Environment and Sustainable Development found that Natural Resources Canada couldn't point to a single ton of carbon reduced after spending, I think it was $70 million on this so far. So my plea and our plea to our Minister of Finance is no money for fake climate action. That means no money for small modular nuclear reactors, no money for carbon capture, utilization, and storage, no money for things that are named in ways that suggest they're about climate action, but are really about keeping the fossil fuel sector happy with your government while you expand fossil fuels while at the same time pretending you're contracting them. And unfortunately, that's the case with this government for all the good policies. I have to say, there's a lot of good policies. When people list them, you can say, well, those are good policies. The only thing that matters is, does it add up to Canada doing what's required for our share, not our fair share, but just a reasonable share of holding to 1.5 degrees Celsius? Currently, it's not. Dr. Kuttner pointed out that 1.5 is on a bell curve. Let me put it another way. When you add up all of the policies of all the governments and all the promises of all the governments all around the world, of which Canada's promise is among the weakest, you add them all up and crunch the numbers, and in Glasgow at COP26, we were informed that as a result of all the new pledges, we would still be well above 2010 levels by 2030. And we know that the IPCC advice is clear and compelling. The only way, not one of several, the only way to hold to 1.5 degrees is at least a 45% reduction globally against 2010 levels by 2030. That is essential. And we are currently, we went into COP with a 16% over 2010 arrival at 2030. And after all the new promises, we're at 13.7% above 2010 levels by 2030. We are headed for failure, and failure is not acceptable because we don't get a do-over. When the scientists tell us, as they have been telling us clearly, the window on holding to 1.5 is closing and closing rapidly, that says you don't get to fix it by 2050 with magical machines that don't exist, which are right now carbon capture and storage exists, but has never worked at the scale it was promised and has always been the most expensive way to reduce a ton of carbon. So yeah, pretty clearly we're hoping that the budget will not include a tax benefit, a subsidy for fossil fuels in the form of carbon capture, utilization, and storage.
Briefly, in addition, not only are Greens calling for this tax credit not to be applied, but over 400 climate scientists and academics have made the same call that carbon capture is a false solution. Only a small number of which have had the chance to witness to the committee you referenced earlier. And so I'd encourage to read the letter being put forward by these academics from across the country who are similarly calling for investments in real climate solutions.
We have a question from Madeleine Blemorin. Madeleine, can you hear us?
Excusez-moi, bonjour.
Bonjour.
La question s'adresse à Madame May et je suis désolée, ce n'est pas tout à fait au sujet du GIEC. Madame May, je vous entendais hier dans le débat sur la constitution du comité pour étudier la loi sur les mesures d'urgence et je voyais que vous disiez qu'il faut faire attention. Et la traduction, c'est, vous disiez, si on pense qu'un groupe de personnes s'est déjà fait une opinion si ferme qu'on ne peut pas lui faire confiance pour enquêter, vous disiez, je pense que c'est une supposition erronée. Là, c'est probablement la traduction que j'ai vue. Madame May, est-ce que vous faites référence aux conservateurs? Est-ce que ça veut dire qu'à votre avis, les libéraux ont tort d'exclure les conservateurs de la présidence de ce comité-là?
Oui, merci pour la question. Oui, c'est une question pour la formation du comité. À mon avis, nous avons le plus grand problème maintenant, c'est nouvelle dans notre démocratie, c'est la question que notre population, les citoyens du Canada, maintenant ont les idées différentes que qu'est-ce que c'est les faits. C'est exactement comme j'ai dit hier, comme la Maison-Blanche sur M. Trump, qu'il dit que nous avons les faits, oui, et puis aussi il y a les autres faits. Et ce n'est pas clair pour les Canadiens. Pour la première fois, nous avons les faits et les mensonges. Et il y a peut-être, c'est clair que c'est une minorité, mais le groupe qui donne leur appui pour l'occupation d'Ottawa, sont absolument engagés pour avec les citations, les faits qui sont vraiment pas vrais. Mais à cause de les sources de désinformation, comme par exemple, aussi avec la Russe encore, le site web de Russia Today, c'est un de ces sites, mais aussi Fox News, les autres, qui convainquent notre population que la pandémie, ce n'est pas vrai, qu'il y a les impositions impossibles pour leur liberté. À cause de ça, je dis que c'est important d'avoir une seule source, un seul point d'accord. Qu'est-ce que c'est la réalité? Qu'est-ce que c'est les faits? Pour ça, je pense que c'est meilleur d'avoir tout le monde dans le comité. Puis aussi, je pense que ce n'est pas une mauvaise idée d'avoir des co-président de conservateur puis un libéral. Je pense que c'est clair que les conservateurs vont jouer un grand rôle sur ce comité. Moi-même et M. Morrice, comme vert, nous sommes disponibles aussi pour participer dans le comité. Mais c'est important, je pense, de ne pas fermer la porte contre l'idée que comme Canadiens, comme députés, nous sommes capables de trouver la réalité, la vérité, avec une approche collaborative et de rendre après le travail du comité une source pour les citoyens du Canada avec confiance que c'est la vérité, pas seulement les faits différents comme une grande guerre d'effet. C'est quelque chose de nouveau. C'est pour moi, j'ai travaillé dans les questions environnementales pendant toute ma vie. Jamais j'ai vu ça au Canada. C'est un développement où je trouve très dangereux pour nous comme un pays et comme une démocratie.
Donc, vous dites que les libéraux ont tort d'exclure les conservateurs de la présidence ou de la coprésidence de ce comité-là?
Oui, je pense que je ne vais pas utiliser les mots si durs comme ça. Je pense que c'est seulement l'idée d'ouvrir la porte à la possibilité que les conservateurs, après toutes les choses affreuses que député après député a dit, peut-être dans un comité avec le niveau de sécurité, avec la vérité, avec les clos, peut-être, je veux dire le Parti libéral, pensait que peut-être il sera possible d'avoir une approche plus ouverte. Et c'est clair que aussi les libéraux ont aussi exclu lui-même. Ce n'est pas un président, coprésident libéral et puis pas les conservateurs. La décision du gouvernement, c'est d'éliminer la possibilité d'avoir les coprésidents libéraux ni conservateurs. Ce n'est pas un tort, c'est l'idée avec l'idée avec pouvoir. Mais peut-être ce n'est pas la seule chose que sera possible pour le meilleur résultat.
Thank you. We have time for one last question in the room. David?
Yeah, I'll just try and be quick with this. Do you think that the Liberal government is doing everything that they can to support Ukraine?
No, I don't think so. Not yet.
Okay, what more would you like to see them do, and do you support them sending lethal weapons?
I 100% do not support them sending lethal weapons. I think that in terms of aid, in terms of immigration supports and stuff like that, as was discussed last night, these are things that are still open doors.
Can you just expand why you don't support lethal weapons? Just, yeah, is it the Green Party's policy?
It's the Green Party stance of nonviolence, and that we must do everything we can to support in a nonviolent way. And I just, have a thing deep inside about not supporting weapons exports at any point. And I think that there is a lot of room for humanitarian aid and support. And freezing assets.
The party does support the UN's position that you can defend yourself, right, if you are attacked. Is that not the case in this circumstance?
It is, yes. But we are not there. We are going to be contributing to violence in one way or another if we are sending weapons. Right.
Being invaded, right? Is that...
Yes.
You don't believe that, or like?
No, okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Get it straight here. Yes, Ukraine is being invaded. And right now we are looking to have all diplomatic, all sanction, freezing of assets, and other types of supports provided. If we come to a point again where there is a larger question, I think we need to come back and discuss it. But right now, no. And I think that even at that point, the type of support that I'm comfortable with is not sending weapons. It's supporting the people there or supporting with people, but it is not sending weapons. And by supporting with people, I do not mean supporting with people to fight, but supporting with people to support, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. Thank you for clarifying that. Do any of the MPs want to add to that? Or?
Leader.
I know that Mike also wants to comment on this. It's a very interesting thing right now that the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Germany is Annalena Baerbock, whom I know because she's the co-leader of the German Greens. And their Minister of Economy and Climate, Robert Baerbock, is also a co-leader of the German Greens. And it's a struggle. The German Greens have been through this before on the question of whether Germany should be engaged back in the question of a NATO mission in the Balkans. What we want to be clear about here is that there's more Canada can do. I'm extremely proud of what our Minister of Finance and Deputy Prime Minister has been able to do. It seems to me from news reports that she's played a key role in convincing other governments to deprive Russia of swift financial transaction. That platform is going to punish Russia in a way. We don't want to punish Russians. They're going to suffer anyway because of the recklessness of Vladimir Putin. And the Russian people, the ones that are gathering by the thousands in squares in anti-war rallies. This is impressive and inspiring, and the people of Russia should not be confused with Vladimir Putin. We have to do everything possible to punish Vladimir Putin in every personal way that approaches his wealth, his assets, his cronies, the gang of organized criminals that are closest to Putin that have been robbing Russia ever since the USSR fell apart, robbing Russia of their large sturgeon for caviar in ways that wipe out a species, robbing Russia's forests, pursuing a path in oil and gas. There's a lot Russia has done that has been gaining wealth for the oligarchs, going after their wealth, which is why I, from the sidelines, mentioned assets. There's a home that was purchased for $18 million in my riding. It's a mansion on the waterfront. Seize it. There are Russian assets across Canada that have been part of money laundering schemes and taking housing out of the accessibility for people. Obviously, an $18 million mansion is not affordable housing, but there are Russian assets across Canada. We need to find ways, as the EU has done, is saying we're closing the airspace to Russian flights, but the EU Commission also added, including private planes of the oligarchs. So targeting and targeting and targeting so that Putin's allies pressure him to say, because we're not going to win a ground war with a country that's willing to use nuclear weapons. That's the huge danger here. The less provocative we can be while being surgical and effective in punishing Vladimir Putin and the people who support him, the more that we can get billionaires stepping away from him to say, oh, this was a bad idea. What made you think this was a good idea? So it's very critical that we do what's effective to protect the people of Ukraine. And that will mean doing everything we can to avoid giving Putin any excuse for using nuclear weapons, because I believe he's capable of it. This is terrifying. Thanks to Putin and his puppet, Donald Trump, we have lost progress on the elimination of nuclear weapons. The progress that Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan had been making was reversed when Trump was in the White House. Did you see Trump is saying today to Americans, if you want to look for a place where democracy is suppressed, look no farther than Canada. Let's go liberate those folks. We have a very serious threat to democracy from disinformation. In any case, when I say we need to do more, I don't think for 1 minute that this government is not looking at every option. When they say everything's on the table, I know that they'll be looking at withdrawing diplomats and going after assets. We need to get an act before Parliament tomorrow to reform the Canadian Pension Plan Investment Board to say your goal here, because it's in the legislation, is not to get maximum return on investment. Your goal here is to look through the lens of peace and security and climate lens and say, we're pulling all of our investments out of Russia and we're divesting from fossil fuels. Right now, every one of our pensions is tied up in fossil fuels and invested in Russia, because years ago, the Canada Pension Investment Board Act was passed to say the only thing that matters here is making money. We're playing with your investment. I don't care. Take my public pension plan and stick it under a bed somewhere. Don't play the markets with our pension anymore. And if you're going to do that, make sure every investment is in Canada to support affordable housing, to support the massive amount of work that Dr. Kuttner mentioned, which is we have to rebuild virtually our entire public water and sewer system because it was built for another climate. We need investments in Canada. We don't need them in Russia, and we don't need them in fossil fuels. So again, there's more we can do. We can always do more, but we have to do this through also the very clear threat that Putin has laid out of his willingness to use nuclear weapons, which means that if we send weapons to Ukraine, number one, of course, it's against our policies, against our principles, but it's also dangerous. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, David. Wanted to add one more in terms of specific actions that the government can take. Last night, you likely heard parliamentarians from across party lines were calling to do more to support Ukrainians seeking refuge, specifically by waiving visa requirements, and would encourage the federal government to move on this as soon as possible. Thank you.
I will just echo both of those. That was the immigration thing I was referencing, actually. Thank you. And that at all costs, not at all costs, but as much as we possibly can, given the threat, we need to avoid war, larger scale war.
Perfect. Thank you. Let's conclude the press conference. Ceci m'a fait la conférence de presse. Merci.
Thank you. Thank you. Merci.